How ancient Egyptians counted their days with water clocks. If you were to find yourself along the banks of the Nile some 4,000 years ago, the first thing you would notice is the rhythm. The Nile does not rush. It glides. It rises and falls in seasons, just as the sun does in the sky. And life for the ancient Egyptians was shaped entirely around that rhythm. Yet while the river gave a kind of grand calendar in its floods and retreats, people also needed something much smaller, a way to measure the little slices of time that filled each day. How long a watchman stood guard, how long a priest chanted prayers in the temple, how long before the next ritual offering was due. Out of this need came one of the world's earliest devices for marking the hours, the water clock, or clepsydra. Now, to imagine an Egyptian water clock, you must picture a stone vessel, shaped like a bowl or pot, carefully smoothed inside. Along its inner surface were tiny, almost invisible markings, sometimes lines, sometimes dots. A thin hole was cut at the bottom, small enough that water could only trickle out slowly, drop by drop. As the water levels sank, it passed each mark in turn, telling priests and officials how much time had slipped away. A single pot of dripping water could represent an hour of prayer or the passing of a watch in the night. You might wonder, why water? Why not sand, as with the hourglass that came later? The answer lies partly in the Nile itself. The Egyptians were surrounded by water in ways both abundant and controlled. Their irrigation canals, ditches, and flood basins meant that water was something they understood intimately. It could be guided, diverted, or measured in increments. And unlike fire or the stars, water was always present, even on cloudy nights or in the sealed chambers of temples where starlight could not reach. The earliest records we have of Egyptian water clocks come from inscriptions dated to around 1500 BCE, though some scholars suspect they were used even earlier. A particularly famous example was found in the ruins of the Temple of Karnak, a large stone vessel carved with inscriptions to mark the hours of the night. Imagine the priest who once stood before it in the dim light of oil lamps, listening to the steady drip, drip, drip of water leaving the pot. For him, each drop was not just a measurement, but a sacred rhythm, guiding the chants, the offerings, the movements of the temple staff. The simplicity of the device hides its subtlety. Because the length of hours changes with the seasons, the days are longer in summer, shorter in winter. The water clocks had to be adjusted. Some were carved with sets of markings that corresponded to different months. A pot might show one scale for the long summer nights and another for the short winter ones. In this way, a single vessel could keep track of time year-round, adapting to the breathing rhythm of the Nile Valley. Daily life in Egypt was full of rituals where such precision mattered. The rising sun had to be greeted at just the right moment by temple priests. Legal cases might be heard for set durations. Even farmers, guided mostly by the seasons, had an interest in more immediate timekeeping. How long to water a particular field, how long to boil grain or brew beer. How long to wait before the next offering in a household shrine? For these humble tasks, the steady drip of a clepsydra provided a measure that everyone could rely on. Of course, a water clock was not perfect. Heat could make the water flow more quickly, and dust could clog the tiny hole. The stone vessels were heavy, and not everyone could afford such a thing. Still, their presence in temples and official buildings gave a sense of order that stretched beyond the practical. They symbolized the Egyptian desire to bind even something as slippery as time into the careful structure of ritual. Think of the contrast. Outside, the desert stretched in timeless silence, the stars moving endlessly overhead, the Nile rising and falling in its age-old cycle. Inside, a priest bent over a dripping pot, carving the days and nights into equal slices. It was both ordinary and profound, a mixture of boredom and devotion. And yet, as the drops of water fell, the priest must have wondered something. Could the gods themselves hear the ticking of this watery clock? Did time belong to humans alone? Or were they simply borrowing it from a larger rhythm that the divine had already set in motion? The Egyptian clepsydra began as a tool for priests, but as centuries passed, its quiet dripping found new purposes. In a society as layered and orderly as ancient Egypt, a device that could measure time with some reliability had many possible uses. From temples to royal courts, from farms to workshops, the water clock's patient rhythm became a part of daily order. In the temple of Karnak, for instance, the great water clock was not only used for prayer schedules. Astronomers employed it to observe the stars. Egypt had a long tradition of watching the night sky for both agricultural and spiritual reasons. The rising of Sirius, the bright dog star, was tied to the annual flood of the Nile. To track such appearances, priests needed a way to divide the night into regular parts. The water clock, placed alongside a chart of stars, gave them a kind of cosmic calendar. Each drop of water carried them closer to the rising of a particular constellation. Each mark passed in the bowl aligning with a star's appearance in the sky. This connection between water and starlight is a striking one. On the one hand, you had the very earthly, practical flow of liquid from a vessel. On the other, the distant and silent heavens, glittering beyond human reach. Yet together they allowed Egyptians to measure and predict, to bring both earth and sky into harmony. But water clocks did not remain only in temples. Over time, they appeared in the courts of pharaohs and in the hands of officials. Legal disputes, especially those involving land or harvest, often required time limits. A court might allow a person a certain number of hours to present a case. To keep this fair, judges relied on a clepsydra. As water trickled away, so too did the opportunity for words. In a society built on order and ritual, it was important that even justice flowed according to time's measure. Craftsmen, too, found a place for water clocks. Consider the brewer, whose vats of barley mash needed careful timing to avoid sourness, or the baker, whose ovens demanded regular intervals to produce loaves that would not burn. In these trades, a rough sense of the sun's height in the sky was sometimes enough. But for those who wanted consistency, a small clay clepsydra might have been used. It was not common for every household, but in the bustling workshops of cities, its steady drip could set a rhythm of work. It is worth noting that the Egyptians were not alone in their fascination with water as a measure of time. Similar devices appeared in Mesopotamia, perhaps even earlier, and the Greeks would later adopt and refine the clepsydra for their own purposes. But Egypt's contribution was distinctive. Their stone vessels were carefully inscribed, not only with marks, but sometimes with hieroglyphs that connected the passage of hours with gods or festivals. To them, time was never entirely separate from religion. Imagine, then, a day in which the same device might guide the chant of a priest, the verdict of a judge, and the brewing of beer for a feast. It is a humbling thought, a simple pot of dripping water quietly shaping the lives of thousands. Yet, as with all inventions, the water clock also faced its limits. Egyptians knew its flaws. The water flowed faster in hot weather, slower in cold. The markings wore away with use. Some experimented with improvements. Instead of letting water drip out, a few designs let water drip in, filling a vessel where a floating marker indicated the time. Others sought to make the outflow more regular with carefully carved channels. Still, perfection was elusive, and perhaps that was part of the appeal. Time itself is never perfectly steady, not even today. Days shorten and lengthen with the seasons. The Nile floods more one year and less the next. The water clock, with its quirks and imbalances, was a fitting companion to a world that moved in rhythms rather than exact ticks. By the late New Kingdom period, the clepsydra had become a symbol of learned authority. Those who used it, priests, astronomers, judges, were people of standing. Ordinary farmers may never have touched one, but they lived under schedules and calendars that the water clock helped create. Even the timing of great festivals, such as the Opet festival in Thebes, may have relied on hours marked by dripping vessels. And yet, one question lingered even for the Egyptians themselves. Could humans truly measure the divine flow of time? Or were they merely carving a pattern into something far larger than they could control? As Egypt moved through its long history, from Old Kingdom to Ptolemaic times, the water clock remained a fixture in temples and courts, though never without its imperfections. The steady drip of water was useful, but it could not compete with the sun's daily arc or the moon's waxing and waning. Over time, Egyptians themselves began to treat the clepsydra less as a precise tool and more as a symbolic companion to ritual. It was in the hands of others, however, that the Egyptian water clock found new life. When Greek scholars traveled to Egypt, they encountered the stone vessels carved with sloping sides, each marked with hieroglyphs. Greek engineers, curious and ever eager to refine, adapted the design. Instead of water flowing out, they favored systems where water flowed in, raising a float that marked the passage of time. Some even experimented with adding gears and dials, creating devices that edged closer to true mechanical clocks. In Athens, the clepsydra became a central part of court life. Every speaker in a trial was given a fixed measure of water in a vessel. As it dripped away, so too did the time allowed to make arguments. One can picture the anxious lawyer glancing more often at the dwindling trickle than at the jury. In this way, the Egyptian invention was woven into Greek democracy, not through temples and stars, but through civic debate. Later, the Romans also borrowed the idea. They were less enchanted by the stars than the Greeks or Egyptians, but they appreciated order. In Roman military camps, simple clepsydras helped mark the changing of the guard. The trickle of water became a silent bell, calling soldiers to wakefulness in the middle of the night. And yet, even as the device spread across cultures, its flaws remained. Water did not drip at the same pace in summer heat as it did in winter. Chill, dust, cracks, an uneven carving made every clock slightly different. For centuries, no one fully solved the problem. Time itself resisted being captured. In Egypt, the clepsydra eventually faded into the background. Sundials and astronomical observation continued, and in later periods, Greek-style mechanical adaptations overshadowed the old stone basins. Still, the water clock never truly disappeared. Archaeologists have found fragments of them across the Nile Valley, from Karnak to smaller provincial towns, each a reminder of their quiet importance. But perhaps the greater legacy of the Egyptian clepsydra was not technical, but philosophical. To carve a vessel, to mark it with hours, to watch water slip away drop by drop, this was to engage with the mystery of time itself. It taught patience. It suggested that human life, like water, flows continuously, steadily, beyond our control. Priests may have used it to summon prayers at the right hour, judges to control arguments, craftsmen to guide their trades. But all of them were also reminded of something deeper, that time was never theirs to command, only to observe. And here lies the quiet paradox. The Egyptians tried to measure eternity with clay pots and dripping water. They knew their method was flawed, but they pursued it anyway. Each clepsydra was both practical and symbolic, an object that told them how to act now, and also reminded them of the vast river of time that carried them toward forever. Today, when we glance at our digital clocks or hear the precise tick of a wristwatch, it is easy to forget the slow beginnings of timekeeping. Yet the water clock has left its trace. The very idea of dividing the day into measured hours, of trusting a device to mark life's rhythm, can be traced in part to the priests of Karnak, listening to the soft sound of dripping water in the night. And so, as you imagine the ancient chamber dark, cool, the air scented faintly with stone and damp, the clepsydra still sits in the corner, drop by drop, hour by hour. It continues to mark the rhythm of lives long past. Perhaps the final question it leaves us with is this: if time can be measured, can it ever truly be possessed? Or does it, like water, always slip quietly through our hands? The daily duties of Roman aqueduct keepers. You were a Roman living in a great city such as Rome itself, Entiums or Carthage. You would have seen the aqueducts every day without much thought. Long stone arches stretching like a row of silent giants across valleys, carrying water to fountains, baths, and cisterns. For most citizens, the aqueducts were simply there, like the sun or the hills. But for a small group of workers, the equerri, or water keepers, those structures were not silent monuments. They were workplaces, demanding constant vigilance. A Roman aqueduct was not a single structure, but a system. Channels carved through hillsides, tunnels dug into mountains, covered conduits running for miles, and finally the arches that lifted water above ground. Each part could falter. A small crack might widen into a leak. Roots might invade the channel. Silt might gather in basins. The waterkeeper's job was to walk, inspect, clean, and repair. Slowly, patiently, day after day, they followed the flow. Imagine rising at dawn, before the streets grew busy. The keeper strapped a small tool pouch around his waist, chisels, a small hammer, perhaps a knife for scraping roots. He carried a wax tablet for notes, for every leak had to be reported. Then he began his walk along the conduit. The sound of water was his companion, a low rush when the flow was high, a gentle trickle when the aqueduct ran narrow. Every so often, he stopped at a castellum, a small distribution tank where water divided into channels. Here he inspected the settling basins. Silt and sand collected at the bottom. If left too long, they would clog the pipes. The keeper knelt, scooped and cleared, his hands damp and gritty. It was not glamorous work, but without it, fountains in the city would sputter dry, and public baths would stand silent. The also watched for theft. Romans were clever at tapping into the system illegally. A pipe driven into a wall, hidden beneath plaster, could divert water into a private villa. Such thefts reduced the flow for the public fountains, and so keepers had to be alert. If a house seemed suspiciously well supplied, the keeper might scrape away plaster and reveal the trick. Reports were written, fines imposed, and sometimes disputes dragged through Roman courts. Not all duties were stern. Sometimes the keeper simply measured the flow. With a trained eye, he could tell if water was too low for the season, or if recent rains had swelled the source. In times of drought, this was crucial knowledge. Officials in the city depended on such observations to decide how to ration water. The work was long, often lonely. Some aqueducts stretched for dozens of miles. The keeper might spend the better part of a day walking from one section to another, under the blazing sun or in the chill of early morning. But yet there was a rhythm to it, the steady sound of water, the sight of arches against the sky, the scribbling of notes on a wax tablet, a life lived in step with the flow. And perhaps, as he walked, the keeper thought about the strangeness of his duty. Here was water, carried across valleys and through hills, tamed by stone and mortars. And here he was, a single man with a hammer, keeping that vast system alive. Could he ever truly master the water? Or was he only following it, always, a step behind its eternal movement? In Rome, water was never simply water. It was life, health, luxury, and status. To drink from a public fountain was ordinary. To bathe in the Grand Thermae was civic pride. To enjoy a private pipe leading straight into a courtyard pool, that was prestige. And standing quietly in the background of all these experiences was the aqueduct keeper, whose small notes and routine checks shaped the flow of abundance. The equerri themselves were not high in social standing. Many were freedmen or low-ranking workers, employed under the larger office of the curator aquarum, the official responsible for Rome's vast water system. By the early empire, this was a prestigious post, sometimes held by senators or imperial appointees. Below them were engineers, scribes, inspectors, and finally, the aqueduct keepers who trudged along the channels. Their wages were modest, their names rarely recorded, and yet, without them, the grandeur of Rome's water supply would falter. Roman society valued hierarchy, and even water was divided along those lines. Public fountains were free, accessible to every citizen. Public baths charged small fees, but were widely used. Meanwhile, private connections to the aqueduct system required special permission. The wealthy lobbied for these, bribed when they could, and hired their own workers to maintain the pipes inside their estates. Disputes inevitably arose, and the aqueduct keepers found themselves in the middle of quarrels. When they uncovered an illegal tap, they risked angering powerful men. A poor keeper might write his report and wonder if it would ever be acted upon, or if it would quietly vanish under pressure from a senator's household. The politics of water grew especially sharp during shortages. In a hot summer, when springs ran low, officials had to ration the flow. Aqueduct keepers were then charged with redirecting water, closing one channel, opening another. Imagine the scene. A keeper standing at a castellum divider, sliding wooden sluice gates, adjusting bronze fittings, carefully measuring the stream. Citizens might gather, watching anxiously, for they knew their baths or fountains depended on the balance. And yet, despite these moments of tension, the work retained a strangely invisible quality. The average Roman never thought of the unless water stopped flowing. It was taken for granted that fountains would pour and baths would steam, just as it is taken for granted today that taps will open. This invisibility had its advantages. Aqueduct keepers were rarely celebrated, but neither were they constantly scrutinized. They lived in the quiet shadow of Rome's greatness, shaping it without fanfare. There were, however, moments of recognition. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, praised the water system of Rome as among its greatest achievements, greater even than roads or theaters. He marveled at the scale of the aqueducts, the endless arches, the skill of engineers. Though he did not name the humble workers, one suspects that the equerri would have nodded with weary pride at his words, knowing their daily vigilance kept him alive. One can imagine the keeper returning home at the end of a long day, his sandals dusty, his hands sore from scraping away roots or patching cracks. Neighbors might barely ask about his work, yet as he drank from a clay cup of cool water, he must have felt the quiet weight of his role. The city bathed, dined, and worshipped because he had kept the water flowing. And here the thought lingers. In a society where emperors commanded armies and senators debated laws, could it be that a nameless man with a wax tablet had as much power over daily comfort as any noble? For what was Rome without water, and who but the keeper ensured its steady stream? When you look today at the Pont du Gard in France, or the soaring arches near Segovia in Spain, you see only stone and silence. The water is gone, the channels are dry, and the arches stand as monuments. Yet, in their working days, these structures were alive. They hummed with the sound of flowing water and the quiet labor of the aqueduct keepers. For centuries, Rome's aqueducts supplied cities across the empire. Some carried water more than 50 miles, losing barely an inch of fall across the whole distance. The engineering was remarkable, but it was never self-sustaining. Maintenance was relentless. Lime deposits thickened the channels. Weeds sprouted. Rodents gnawed. Without constant care, water would stagnate or spill away. The aqueduct knew this truth well. Even a marvel needs mending. The endurance of Roman aqueducts lay not only in their stone, but in the people who served them. The keepers were trained to notice the smallest change. A damp mark on a wall, a shift in the sound of running water, the discoloration of a basin. Their senses became instruments of maintenance. A good Aquarius was less a laborer than a living gauge, reading the system as a physician reads a pulse. Even as Rome declined, many aqueducts remained in use. Some were repaired under later emperors. Others fell into ruin, their stones quarried for fortresses or churches. Still, echoes of the aqueduct keepers' work survived. In medieval monasteries, brothers tended water channels much as Roman workers had. In Islamic Spain, sophisticated irrigation drew on Roman methods, and in parts of Italy, fragments of old aqueducts carried trickles of water well into modern centuries. When modern engineers studied Roman aqueducts, they marveled at the scale, but also at the diligence implied by their upkeep. The structures were designed with access points, inspection shafts, and settling tanks clear signs that daily care was assumed. Rome did not rely on miracles of endurance. It relied on ordinary men, walking, watching, and cleaning. There is something curiously comforting in this thought. Great civilizations are often remembered for emperors, battles, or monuments. Yet their endurance rests just as much on quiet routines. A city does not function without bread, without markets, without water. And water does not flow without those who keep it flowing. Picture again the Aquarius at the end of his day. He has patched a leak, recorded an illegal pipe, measured a flow, and cleared a basin. No one applauds him. No triumph is held in his name. Yet tomorrow the fountains will still bubble, the baths will still steam, and children will still cup their hands to drink cool water in the summer heat, all because he did what seemed dull and necessary. And as we look at the empty aqueducts today, we might wonder, are the arches more impressive than the routines they required, which truly sustained Rome the grandeur of stone, or the patience of those who followed the water's path, step after careful step? How medieval Icelanders measured time with sheep and shadows. When you picture Iceland in the Middle Ages, you must imagine a land caught between light and darkness. In summer, the sun barely dipped below the horizon, giving long days that stretched endlessly. In winter, the sun crept low, rising late, fading early, and leaving people in the uncertain blue of twilight for much of the day. In such a place, time was never measured the way it was in cities farther south. There were no cathedral bells ringing the hours, nor great sundials casting their precise shadows. Instead, Icelanders lived by rhythms that were both natural and improvisational, finding order in a landscape that often refused to provide it. For medieval Icelanders, time was not something divided into neat hours on a clock face. It was felt through the length of shadows, the position of the sun, the habits of animals, and the flow of daily chores. Farmers rising in the morning did not ask whether it was 7 o'clock. They asked whether the sheep had stirred, or whether the light on the mountain slope had reached a certain stone. In this way, time was measured not by machinery, but by the world itself. One of the most curious methods was the use of sheep. Sheep were central to Icelandic survival. Their wool provided warmth, their milk offered nourishment, and their meat supplied food through harsh winters. Watching sheep was not just animal courage, became a way to track the passage of hours. Shepherds, often young boys or older men, would learn to note when the sheep tended to graze, when they lay down to rest, and when they gathered together before dusk. These patterns, repeated day after day, became as reliable as any clock. If you saw the sheep begin to cluster at the gate, it meant evening was drawing close, regardless of what the sun itself was doing. But shadows were just as important. Icelanders observed carefully how the sun cast itself across their valleys, mountains, and homes. A rock might serve as a marker, or a certain turf wall might be known to hold shadow at midday. Farmers would say, when the shadow reaches the barn roof, it is time to call the workers in. These were practical local measurements of time unique to each farm, each family, and each landscape. No one in Reykjavik, had the city existed then, would measure the hour in quite the same way as someone in a distant fjord. Yet the lack of clocks did not mean a lack of order. Icelandic society needed regularity to function, especially for assemblies like the Althing, the great gathering where laws were made and disputes settled. Here, time was kept in broader strokes. The days, travel, the weeks of summer counted by church festivals, the months measured by the Old Norse calendar. It was not precision that mattered, but agreement. If everyone understood that a fortnight after midsummer meant a certain span, then business could be done. Exact hours were less important than shared rhythms. Still, there is something deeply human in the smaller ways people tried to keep track. A mother might know that when the sheep returned from grazing, she had an hour before dusk to prepare supper. A shepherd might glance at the shadow of his staff on the ground to guess how long until he should drive the flock home. Time was not a number. On a dial it was a relationship between people, animals, and land. This relationship to time created a slower way of living, without bells chiming each hour, without watches ticking at the wrist. Days unfolded according to needs rather than deadlines. Work began when there was light enough to see, and ended when darkness, cold, or tiredness brought it to a close. In summer, this meant long hours of labor, stretching into the endless daylight. In winter, it meant shorter tasks, broken up by the dim light of oil lamps and the rhythm of storytelling in the hall. And so, Icelanders carried on, counting time not in hours and minutes, but in sheep movements, sun angles, and seasonal tides. To us, it may sound imprecise, even chaotic. Yet for them, it was enough. But this leaves us to wonder, when the land itself becomes the clock. How do you decide what is late, what is early, and what it truly means for the day to end? If daily routines in medieval Iceland were marked by sheep and shadows, the broader sweep of life was measured by a different instrument, the Old Norse calendar. Unlike the 12-month Gregorian calendar we use today, the Norse system divided the year into just to have summer and winter. These halves were further divided into weeks, and each week had 7 days. But the division was looser, more practical than scientific. It reflected not the movements of planets, but the movements of life in the far north. Summer began in April by our reckoning, marked not by a date, but by an agreed-upon turning of the season. Winter began in October. The old sagas often describe events happening 3 weeks into summer or at the beginning of winter. To us, that may sound vague, but to medieval Icelanders, it was enough. They knew which tasks belonged to which season: lambing, haymaking, fishing, harvesting driftwood, or preparing for the long darkness. This calendar was not written in books, but lived in memory, in verse, and in lore. Farmers and households relied on almanac staves, wooden sticks, marked with notches and runes that tracked weeks, saints' days, and key festivals. These were not clocks. They were guides, reminders of when the sun would rise high enough, when the sea would be safest, when the Althing would gather. In a land where precision was nearly impossible, the stave offered a shared sense of the year's flow. The Norse calendar also carried with it special days that gave shape to time. Oreblot, a midwinter feast, broke up the monotony of cold. Month with celebration and ritual meals. The first day of summer was so significant that it was treated almost like a national holiday. People exchanged gifts, neighbors visited, and the turning of the year was acknowledged not as a date, but as a lived experience. Time was celebrated, not simply measured. At the same time, Christianity was gradually reshaping Iceland's relationship with time. By the year 1000, when the Althing declared Christianity the official religion. The rhythm of saints' days and church festivals began to mingle with older Norse practices. Bells from simple wooden churches began to mark services, introducing a kind of hour where previously there had been none. Still, the Icelanders adapted this new structure to their world. Easter might determine the timing of spring tasks, while Christmas was celebrated in the deep of winter. But sheep and shadows still kept the household in order. What's striking is how much the law itself depended on these looser reckonings of time. The Althing, Iceland's great open-air parliament, was held at Thingvellir once a year, beginning in midsummer. Travel to the assembly could take days or weeks, depending on where one lived. No precise timetable existed. Men were expected to arrive by the appointed time, which was itself measured by shared custom rather than fixed clocks. Disputes were resolved, laws recited, and punishments declared, all under a schedule set not by the hour but by daylight and agreement. When darkness fell, the assembly paused. When the sun returned, business resumed. In this way, Icelanders combined the immediate shadows, sheep, chores, with the long view of the Norse calendar. Their lives were framed not by punctuality, but by appropriateness. Was it the right season for hay? Was it the right time for lambing? Had enough daylight passed for the workers to return? Questions of time were never answered with numbers. They were answered with tasks, seasons, and agreements. It is perhaps difficult for us, living in a world of clocks and alarms, to imagine such a system. We are accustomed to being 5 minutes late or 10 minutes early. But in medieval Iceland, lateness was measured differently. If you missed the sheep's return, you were late to gather them. If you delayed the hay harvest, you risked losing fodder for the winter. Time was practical, lived, and deeply tied to survival. Still, this raises an intriguing thought. If the calendar and the seasons structured the year, and sheep and shadows structured the day, what did Icelanders make of the in-between, those moments when neither system gave a clear answer? In a land without clocks, it was not only sheep, shadows, and seasonal staves that marked the passage of time. For medieval Icelanders, stories themselves became a way to measure life's unfolding. A saga told by the fire could chart an evening's length as surely as the movement of the sun marked a day. Imagine a turf house on a winter night. The wind presses hard against the walls. Snow drifts at the doorway, and daylight has long since faded. Families gather inside, wrapped in wool, with only the glow of a hearth to mark the center of the room. In this space, time is not divided by minutes, but by verses, tales, and genealogies. A farmer might say, "It is as long as it takes to recite the story of Grettir the Strong," a measure more human than mechanical. The Icelandic sagas were not just entertainment, but tools of memory. They recorded genealogies, feuds, journeys, and laws, passed down orally for generations before being written. To know a saga by heart was to carry an archive of history within oneself. And in a culture where time was measured loosely, stories helped pin events to a kind of remembered calendar. This feud began 3 summers after the famine, or he was born the year the great driftwood came ashore. In this way, Icelanders wove time into memory. Each event gained meaning not by its exact date, but by its place in the chain of remembered happenings. The sagas were full of such markers: winters of unusual cold, summers of abundant fish, or years when volcanoes darkened the skies. These became their time stamps. Where we say in 1347, they might say in the year the sheep starvation struck the valleys. Even domestic rhythms were narrated in this way. Children grew up learning not just the names of ancestors, but the lengths of winters, the timing of feasts, and the years of hardship. To remember was to measure. To tell the story was to pass. The measurement on the sagas themselves became a living calendar, one bound not by ink and parchment, but by the voice of the storyteller and the patience of the listener. This reliance on memory also shaped the way Icelandic law worked. At the Althing, the law speaker recited the laws aloud, for there were no official books to consult in the early centuries. Each law was memorized and spoken at the proper season, ensuring that the people not only knew their rights, but also experienced law itself as a passage of time. One might even say that justice in Iceland was measured not by the stroke of a clock, but by the cadence of spoken words. What emerges from this is a picture of a society that understood time as fluid and communal. It was not the ticking of gears, but the turning of lives, the gathering of stories, the rhythm of the herd, the pattern of light and dark. Time in medieval Iceland was deeply human, flexible, shared, and woven into memory. And yet, as the centuries passed, change crept in. Mechanical clocks arrived in Europe in the late Middle Ages, and by the early modern period, they began to filter. Northward, bells would ring more regularly. Merchants would keep stricter hours, and travel would be timed with greater precision. Still, the traces of the old system lingered. Even today, in rural Iceland, people speak of time with a kind of softness, after the hay is in, or before the dark returns. Perhaps this is the quiet lesson hidden in Iceland's peculiar timekeeping. That time, before it became a strict master of hours and minutes, was once a companion. It was something noticed in the sheep's bleating, in the angle of a shadow, in the length of a story by the fire. It was not something counted against us, but something lived with us. And so we might ask, as we close this story, in our world of endless clocks and alarms, would we sleep more easily if we remembered how to measure time not by the second, but by the gentle pace of shadows and stories?